my name is Elena from Mirrix Looms, and today I'm going to teach you how to warp a Mirrix loom for bead weaving without the shedding device. This is a Mirrix loom that we're going to be warping. This is the 8-inch Laney loom. The method that we're using can be used on any of the looms this size and larger, so the 8, 12, 16, 22, 28, 32, and 38-inch looms. Now the first thing that you're going to do is make sure to pull out your leg if you're warping on a table. The 8-inch loom has one fold out leg. The larger looms have two. The next thing that you're going to do is decide the length of the piece. So you're going to try to figure out how high you want your loom to start out. You can make the loom higher by turning the wig nuts, or you can make it lower by turning them in the other direction. So once we've decided on our height, we're going to make sure that the loom is even on both sides. And that's really important to do because we want to start out with an even loom. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our warp coil. Now, you choose a warp coil based on what size beads that you are using. So you're going to take your warp coil and you're just going to put it in the tray at the top of your loom. If you're using the bottom spring kit, which is an accessory that comes separate from our looms, you would use the same warp coil in the tray at the bottom of the loom. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our wooden clips and we're going to make sure that they are facing backwards. There are going to be indentations here and here. And you are going to take your warping bar, which is this, and you are going to place that in those indentations and then just press your clips together a little bit so the warping bar is secure. Now if your clips are starting to fall down the loom a little bit, you can tighten them using these plastic screws right here. So now that we have the warping bar secure, we can start warping. We have to just decide, first of all, how wide a piece that we're making and where we want to place it on the loom. So if you're making a thin piece on a wider loom, you're going to want to either make two thin pieces on different sides of the loom or do one thin piece on one side, and then on the other side what you're going to want to do is tie, once you're done warping, tie a ribbon or something around the other side of the warping bar to balance it, because if you just have one piece on one side and when you release the warping bar from these clips, the warping bar will be unbalanced if you don't tie something to the other end. And that's the same thing if you warp a very thin piece in the middle of a wider loom. What's going to happen when you release these clips is that you'll have an unstable warping bar. So it makes the most sense to make sure there's something on one side and then just balance it off by tying something to the other side. So because this is a fairly thin loom, I'm actually going to warp pretty close to the middle. So if I want that to be the middle, I'm probably going to start warping around right here. But make sure you decide all this before you start warping. Now all I'm going to do to start is I'm just going to tie my warp thread right onto the warping bar. Any way you want. I like to double knot it. So once you tie on, you're ready to actually begin the process. What you're going to do is take your warping thread and bring it under the loom from the back, around the front of the loom, and when you're up here to the warp coil, you're going to place your warp thread in the little space in the pieces of the warp coil or the springs. So what you're going to do for this warping method is you're going to have one warp thread in each of the spaces. So I'm going to place that there, then I'm going to go around the loom. Now here's the big trick to warping. When you hit the warping bar, so you're coming back down, you hit the warping bar here, you're always going to come back the direction that you came in. So I hit the warping bar, I go around the warping bar, and I come back that direction I just came in. Then I'm going to come around. Now every time I hit my warp coil, I'm just going to place my warp thread in the next dent, which is that space over. So then I'm going to go around the loom from the front to the back under it, and I've hit my warping bar. I'm just going to loop around and come back the way I came. So basically what you're doing is you're wrapping your thread around the outside of the loom. You're never going to cross over on the inside. And the reason that we're using this warping bar is, first of all, it's a place for you to tie on and off your warp. But second of all, when you've finished warping, we're going to bring that warping bar down to the bottom of the loom. And if you've woven a piece all the way up, as far up as you can weave, what you can do is loosen the tension, take that warping bar, and start pulling it up the back of the loom. And what that will do is rotate your piece around the back of the loom. So you have more of a place to weave. So this means that you don't just have this far to weave. You have this length and whatever can be rotated to the back of the loom. So that's a really, really great feature. So we're just going to continue here. We're back around. We're going to place the warp thread in the next dent. We're going to go around from the front to the back. And then when we hit that warping bar, we're just going to come back the direction we came. So that is really the most important thing to remember. Come back on the top, place your thread in the next dent over, go around the loom, and now when you hit that warping bar, you're going to loop around and just come back where you came from. Back around the loom, up to the top, next dent over. We've hit that warping bar. We're just going to loop around once and come back where we came. And then we're just going to continue like this. Now, one thing that's important when you're warping is not to let go of your warp thread. You don't want to stop and answer the door or pick up your kid or just drop your warp thread for any reason, because it's important that you have even tension. You don't need to make sure that this is done very tightly because we'll tighten up the warp threads, but we do want to make sure that it's even. You don't want it really tight on one side and really loose on the other side, because that's more difficult to fix later on. So try to warp in an uninterrupted environment. Sometimes I forget and I think, well, I can watch TV and warp at the same time, because warping is second nature once you have done it enough times. But the thing is, it's easy to make a mistake, and you don't want to make a mistake when you're warping because it's really hard to fix. So just take this time. It's kind of a meditative process. And take your time. Make sure that you only have one warp thread in each dent. Make sure that your threads are even. And the other thing to do periodically, which is a good idea, is just place your hand between the back and front warp threads just to make sure you haven't crossed over. Because that's one of the things that's really easy to do if you're not paying attention, is crossover. Like if I had gone over and then I went from the front to the back instead of the back to the front here, I would know that there was a mistake because there's a warp that's crossed over here. So I have to make sure to go from the back to the front, because we're wrapping around the loom. We're never going through there. So I'll just do a couple more. So remember, here we are. We're going the next dent over around the front of the loom from the front to the back. Then when we hit the warping bar, we're just going to go back in the direction we came. And then we're going to go from the back to the front, around the front of the loom, into the next dent over. So the process is actually very easy, very simple. You just have to get the hang of it. So when we've decided how wide we want our piece to be, and it's important to remember that you're going to have one more warp thread than how many beads you have. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I have 13 warp threads, so this piece will be 12 beads across. So now all I am going to do is tie onto my warping bar, just like I tied on before. So one important thing is you want to make sure that this is a tight knot. There we go. Because we want the tension to be even, like I said before. So be careful when tying that knot and making sure that there's no slack there. So once we've tied there, we can cut off our thread. Make sure that everything's even. And then what we're going to do is we're going to swing out our clips. And then we're just going to slowly bring our warping bar to the bottom of the loom. This is for the reason that I mentioned before. So when we want to advance our weaving, if we decide we want to do that, we'll be able to pull that warping bar up towards the top of the loom and move our weaving around the other side. So I'm just going to make sure that my warp threads are organized. And now I'm going to tighten my tension. Now you want it fairly tight, not too tight that you feel like your warp threads are about to break, but tension is really, really important in bead weaving. You want to make sure that it's easy for you to place your beads behind your warp threads there. For some of the larger looms, we have a spring bar that actually goes into the spring between your warp threads and the outside of the spring. Now this is really for wider pieces and tapestry pieces, and you don't need it for such a thin piece, but what this does is prevents any of the warp threads from popping out. So you'd place that in there if you were doing a wider piece on a larger loom. And that's about it. So again, make sure everything is even. Make sure that tension is tight and even. You may want to go through and measure again just to make sure everything is all set up. But there you are ready to weave.